Thank you, everybody, for joining us today at this Executive Book Club. As you know, the Executive Book Club is a forum in which we read for you. So we take a book, typically about every 2 weeks. We work through it and prepare a presentation on what's in it, and we also discuss it here. Today I am on my own, which is a slightly new experience for me because usually I'm here with my colleague Britt Landman, the CEO of Stellenbosch Graduate Institute. So what I'm going to do today as well is if you raise your hand, then you can ask a question. So we don't usually do it in that way. We ask people to put questions in the chat, but if you do have a question, please feel free to ask it. And today we are reviewing a very interesting book in that we're talking about mental models. And I think what I've seen in my time in business is that the people that spend time on working out how they're thinking and how to think better really become better at thinking. And as you progress in an organization, it becomes more and more important to be very critical around what you're hearing, understanding where it's coming from, and being able to discern minor patterns and small things and connect the dots. And I found this book very interesting in terms of that particular aspect. So let's get straight into it. And as I said, please feel free to ask questions and also to make your own observations. If you want to, and we'll entertain those. And Wayne Williams will help me with that. He's our coordinator here in the back end. Thanks to you, Wayne. Okay, so mental models, 30 thinking tools that separate the average from the excellent. Now, you might think that the title is slightly, how can I say, presumptuous, in that how can you sit and say that something that somebody does in a particular way can change the outcome of something? But I think once we get into it, you'll see that there really is something in this, and we'll share with it. So the format of today is I'm going to take you through the book as we normally do. I'm going to take about 10 of these tools and just take you through them broadly, and then just show you some of the other kind of areas that are there. And yeah, I'd love for it to be a discussion and to have different perspectives as well from different colleagues. Okay, cool. So to start off with, our author today is Peter Hollings. The book is available on Kindle. Currently, it's unfortunately only available on the Audible side. I wrote to the author and he said it's because Amazon messed up something with his account and it should be available. And I was very glad that when it did come back, it had some sort of South African pricing. So, before that, it was about 700 Rand, and after asking, it came down to about 250 Rand. So, for those of you on this call, I think I might have reduced the price for you by about 500 Rand. And Peter Hollings, he's written about 5 books. Well, he's actually written about 40 books or so, but 5 in this particular series, which is around kind of thinking better, intentional thinking, think like a genius, that kind of idea. Some of his other books are more around positive psychology, performance management, making impacts on businesses, big ideas, those types of so he generally writes fairly well. The stories are quite engaging. He has lots of examples, and yeah, definitely worth a read. And he also writes a lot about learning how to learn. Okay, so that's an area that I find quite interesting, and I will definitely be reading some of his learning how to learn books as well. It's about 119 pages, which comparative to some of the books that we've dealt with here, which is like 300 and 500 pages, is little. But the problem with it is that it's deceptively easy to think that you're just going to read it quickly. Each these are 30 tools which you can apply in different ways. And he's done it in a nice way where he kind of gives you a sense of the tool itself and what it's for and how it works. And once you start getting into it, I found myself kind of getting distracted a lot because you kind of read it like a little short story, one at a time. And then you're thinking like, am I thinking like that? How can I apply this, et cetera, et cetera. So I found it quite a reflective book in that sense that you have to reflect on what you're reading. It's not just about kind of reading the tool and then it's finished. It's kind of like you're picking up tools in a toolbox, and that in itself creates its own element of having to deal with the issue. Okay. Cool. Okay. I see we've got a little small text here. Okay, so there's 5 chapters. The first chapter deals with decision making for speed and context, and we'll go through all of those today. And the second chapter deals with how to see more clearly. We'll go through most of those today. Then there is how do you do eye-opening problem solving. Then there is how do you kind of check yourself, anti-mental models, how avoidance breeds success. So I found that a very interesting chapter to say with some interesting topics like how to avoid to-do lists, which isn't, I would myself find very difficult to do. But there's situations for that. And then some things that it's easy to throw away, but they're always true, like things like Murphy's Law, Occam's razor, Hanlon razor, Pareto principle, Surgeon's laws, and some Parkinson's laws. So we'll touch on some of those a little bit later. Okay, so it's kind of good. There's an intro section. It's definitely worth reading it. First chapter you read, and it takes you through the different elements, etc. So, and then kind of at the end of the chapter is a little bit of a reflection. It all hangs together fairly nicely. And if you just want to read 1 or 2 or 3 of these, or one in every section, that would also be valid. Okay, cool. So how do we make decisions with more speed and better context? Okay, so what I like about the way that it is written, I think a lot of this is relevant to data science today. Many of the ideas that the author has brought through is things that we teach in our data science courses as well, because as an executive, you want to deconstruct what you're hearing. And one of the issues in that deconstruction is that we need to make better decisions. And when you say better, there's the kind of idea that some things we need to be able to do faster than we've done them in the past without making mistakes. And then as well, how do we really understand what's going on? Okay, so that's kind of where it comes from. So the book starts off and makes the statement to say we are so obsessed with facts, but that those facts aren't necessarily useful unless we connect it to kind of a mental model or a theory of that fact. Okay, so many students kind of bang away at facts and subsequently fail in school and life. Okay, so you know those people that you saw in school that really knew every last thing in the book, but they couldn't necessarily later reason on why it is so or how it all hangs together, etc., etc. And I think often when you're in school, you lose faith because the teacher just tells you to memorize the next thing. Okay, and this is just taking it a step further in terms of saying, unless that fact is actively contributing to kind of your theory of what's going on here or your mental model of what's going on here, you're not really making sense of a new fact. And I think if you've worked in a particular area for a long time, so whether you're working in sales or operations, or you're looking in a large organization in a particular way, you realize that when something starts happening there, it means that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that contributed to that, and it immediately gives you a set of responses, or it impacts your mental model of what's really going on. But there is kind of the observational mental model, so the mental model where you kind of see what is going on, and then there's the other type of mental model where you are thinking in a particular way to solve a problem. Okay, so and I see that so often in various different contexts where a person would come and they see a particular problem and they've acted on that problem in a particular way. So every time they see that problem, they act in exactly the same way. And often that's not the best way to go about things. So what this book kind of tries to do is to say that if your toolbox is going to be every time that you see something that looks like a nail, you take out the hammer and you hit it, it's not work. It won't always work. And when you realize that it's not working, you realize that you will need multiple mental models. Otherwise, you kind of torture reality to fit your limited view of the world. And that is, unfortunately, I've seen many organizations in which kind of you get an alpha person emerging that just shoots everybody down whenever they have new ideas, etc., because they have a particular mental model. And anything else that doesn't fit that model just gets discarded. And so how do we remain open to the possibility that things could be different if we don't develop our thinking into a multidisciplinary process? So the author makes that point very clearly to sit and say we need to start drawing from different disciplines, and these mental models that's been outlined in this book really gives you kind of the best analytical thinking tools from different disciplines and rules of thumb or ways to think about stuff so that you actually end up thinking differently about problems. Okay. So the author quotes Charlie Munger, which is Warren Buffett's number 2, that states that there's about 80 or 90 important models that will carry about 90% of the weight to make you a worldwide person. Okay, so I think if you read book 1 and 2 in this series, and I've only read book 1 so far, I might become a worldwide person one day. But I must say that many of the things that you'll see in the book in terms of the models that it's standing for is stuff that you do sometimes implicitly, but it is nice to kind of formalize some of that thinking and really understand, okay, hang on, there are some practical ways to look at things fairly quickly and realize that you're not going to get a better result thinking differently from that point onwards. Okay, cool. So what's a mental model? Okay, so firstly, it's a blueprint to draw your attention to the important elements of whatever you're facing. And it defines the context that you're in, the background that brought you to that context, and the direction that you need to go out of that. And even that, as a simple kind of idea, is very, very important. So one of the things that happens in decision making is that we get stuck in our own stuckness. And the minute you've got more context background and you start looking for direction, that already is a very powerful tool to start moving you into a new direction. So you can gain understanding even if you lack actual knowledge and experience and the ability to make optimal decisions. So let's just say that you're an aspiring chef. What do you learn as a chef? Okay, so yes, there are kind of basic fundamental building blocks in terms of being able to make a sauce, being able to chop things in a particular way, and understanding what types of flavors exist, etc., and what the basic ingredients are needed for a stock or sauce or typical techniques for different things. And once you start putting those things together, you will generally know how to handle yourself with any kind of type of food. Okay. So there's a lattice work, which I think is a beautiful image of underlying models, and each new recipe would represent an entirely new struggle, an entirely new way to apply that. And even once you start moving from place to place and cooking, every single situation is different. Every night in a restaurant sitting behind the kitchen is different, but those mental models keep driving you in a particular way, and it might come from a much earlier experience to do have the functional skill of being a chef. So, and that translates whether you're a chef or a CEO or an executive of a company. You need this lattice work of models, and different situations require different types of blueprints. Okay, and the objective of a mental model really is to give us an understanding of a situation and a predictable result for what will happen in the future. Okay, so you know that in today's world, if you shout at somebody, they're going to leave. Okay, if you lose your temper, it's going to result in a conflict situation, etc. So those are predictable results. But how do we get better predictable results if we don't have better mental models to take us there? So please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, or if you want to stick up your hand or ask, please, or if you want to comment, it's all open today. Okay, good. Okay, so we all have mental models, okay, and where did we get them? So we've all been around for a while, and I think to ignore that is also really a bad thing. So so don't think that, well, I don't have the mental models. You obviously have. You know how to fight the good fight. You know how to get to the other side, and that didn't just happen, and it isn't just going to go away. The thing is, sometimes we play the wrong mental model in a situation, and yeah, that doesn't play out. So per definition, our own mental models are limited, and because it's a mental model, and it reflects our own kind of biased experience. And I like the area of kind of extreme psychology and understanding where people fall off a mental model or how they can sustain a particular mental model for a long time. But when you start looking into that, it's the things that you were told when you were young, the things that were drilled into you, the things that was repeated in your life, actually, and they become self-limiting beliefs. They are things that you struggle to break out of, and until you kind of create a new mental highway to think differently, you will continue to perpetuate exactly the same things that you've seen before. So many problem-solving approaches gives you different models to evaluate a problem against. And I think sometimes it's worthwhile to kind of take a big list of, for example, these 30 mental models and really take an issue through quite a few of them and sit and see if you get the same results, if you keep the same judgment in place. Also, a quote from Charlie Munger is that he gave actually a long speech on the psychology of human misjudgment. So we are really good at misjudging situations, and anything that's, I also like the quote from Elon Musk that says humanity should do everything to be less dumb, you know, and it comes from not having the right tools to make those judgments and to drive it into a new direction. And I love in the book, there's this fable of the 6 blind men that reach out to an elephant. It's apparently quite a long-standing Eastern myth or fable. And every blind man reaches out to the elephant and looks at the elephant, or they're blind, so they're not looking at the elephant, duh, okay? But the one reports that they think it's a rope, okay, that they've just discovered. The other one thinks it's a type of tree. The other one says there is a softness to this, and other one reports that it's a piece of paper that he's touching. Okay, and as the different parts of the picture emerges, nobody could agree on what they have in front of them because there's no way to put together the whole picture. They decide then to teach each other what they see, and in the one version they actually eventually become suspicious of each other, believing that the others are being dishonest based on their own experiences. And isn't this what we all see? Because often I think when you sit in a meeting and you're trying to get to a shared view, there's so much of yourself that you bring into the situation and you bring your own view of what's happening here, and another person brings their own view of what's happening here, and you find that you often are talking about the same thing, but you're talking it on different levels or different dimensions of the same problem, and it gets frustrating when the different sides of the equation doesn't actually translate into a clear view of what needs to happen here. So in Jainism, which is an Eastern religion, this is called many-sidedness, and it's also often sometimes called conditioned viewpoints. And it argues that immature people deny various aspects of the truth, deluded by the aspects that they do understand. Okay, so, and I honestly believe that executives become stuck in being a particular type of executive because of these conditioned viewpoints. It's like, oh, I've seen it a million times. This is the way it worked before, and they keep on moving into that direction. There's a beautiful poem, which if you can't remember who the author is now, but you can say some of these words. It was 6 men in Indostan that to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephants, through all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy their mind. And then the poem goes into everyone and how they've experienced this elephant. And then it ends, so often theological wars, the disputants, I ween, rail on utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen. You know, and that's where the idea of the elephant in the room comes from, is sometimes we have this thing, we're all talking around it, but we don't really understand what that's about. And it is because we have these conditioned viewpoints. Okay, so moving into the next. So we cannot all be experts in all things. Okay, so mental models and specific decision-making models can assist us with helping to get from A to B in less time, and it can also assist us with defining what A is and what B should be like and what the journey should be. But I think it's important to realize that it's impossible to know all things and to be all things to all people. But the one thing that we can all be as executives is much better at decision making and really taking time to understand where we are, where we're going, and what that should look like. So let's kind of jump into the first mental model. Okay, so I think this is an oldie but goodie. You might recognize it from Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits of Successful People. And it's the interesting thing is I've read the book, and every time somebody has run a seminar about the book, they put up this matrix where what's urgent and important, not urgent, important, not important, but urgent, and etc. But if you actually dive into the book, it's a very small section somewhere, and it isn't really there. It's more in the field book. So and it's not attributed to Eisenhower, but it is in the 7 Habits, but was originally the Eisenhower matrix. Okay. So look really at what is you use this tool to separate true priorities from imposters. So important tasks contribute directly to our short-term or long-term goals. They are absolutely imperative to our work and responsibility or lives. Okay. So those are the things that's important. Okay. If it's short-term, then I need to do it as fast as possible. And if it's long-term, I might also need to do it as fast as possible so that I get to the long-term goal. So there isn't necessarily an implication that because it's long-term, you need to do it at a different point in time. If it's not urgent, then at least schedule a time to do it. And if it is urgent, then do it now, today, as fast as possible, get it out of the way. The interesting thing that I found was on the urgent tasks, and the insight that the author had, which I thought was quite profound, was to say that urgent tasks often demand immediacy and speed, and they usually come from other people. Okay? Because you would, if you knew it was important, you would have possibly done stuff on it before. And I think we often get trusted with urgent tasks because another person needs something from you, which kind of asks you to investigate your relationship with that person to say, why is other people demanding things from me in a particular time frame when obviously we all like to work on what is important, and thus and we don't want to get into that kind of urgency. So I will do the things that I know I have to do for the day. And I think we all experience this. When you walk into the office, you have the plan of what needs to happen to the day, in the day. And by the time you walk out of the office, or if you're at home, you realize that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happened, which isn't necessarily what you came there to do. And the question is, what are those things and why are you being asked to do them? Because there's somebody else's urgent task that has come across your desk. So what are you doing to shape your relationships better, to do more important and less urgent things? Okay. And then the recommendation, obviously, to delegate it to somebody else or eliminate or stop doing specific tasks that isn't your own to do. Okay, cool. So that was useful. The mental model number 2 is to visualize all the dominoes. Okay, so in making a decision, you want to be as informed as possible. And there's some later rules that will deal with what do you do if you don't have information. So when looking at that, I think we often, if I'm asked to make a decision, I would give my knee-jerk response, my first response. And I often find that if I go and reflect carefully on that, maybe sometimes even for a day or two, I would come up with a slightly different version of that response. Okay, so we have to ask, what are the long-term and long-lasting effects of resolving a specific situation? Okay, so if I make somebody asks me, can they have leave? Okay, I say, yes, obviously. Okay, but then if I create a culture that says, well, you can have leave anytime, then later when I tell that person no, that might have a different impact. So I have to think very carefully, what are the long-lasting effects of resolving a specific situation? So we often get trapped in first-order thinking, where we're only focusing on the immediate effect. Okay, so what if we then start thinking twice, which Frick would always say, like, measure twice, cut once. And if I am thinking twice about this, what happens when it is now so, and what is the consequence then? And I can keep on asking that to sort of say, and then, and then, and then. And I'm reminded of a couple of years ago, I was interviewing as the head of strategy for a major consulting firm. And one of the assessments that I had to go through was exactly this. I was given a scenario and I had to say what I would do. And then once you are you've said everything that you want to do, the next level of the questioning was to say, and then. And based on that, as an executive was assessed, how many layers deep can you go? And on that particular day, I went to level 7, which was apparently very good. But yeah, so you need to be able to think what is the consequence and what then, and what is the horizon of your decision, so that you can visualize all the dominoes, so that if you are making a trigger and making one of the dominoes fall, realizing that other dominoes will start falling, and is that the intent of what you're trying to do here? So an interesting example was that of a beauty contest. Do you pick the prettiest person or the person most likely to win if you can win a prize that goes for a person whoever voted for the person who was voted for more often? Okay, so think about that carefully. Why would you want to pick the prettiest? Because the first thing that you assume is that everybody else will pick the prettiest. So that is what I should decide on. And you would then spend all of your time really carefully evaluating who's exactly the prettiest. Okay. Second order thinking would be asking, how do you pick the one that most other people are likely to vote for? Okay. So you might think that this person is the prettiest person in the lineup, but then you realize that the other one has maybe some personality factors that would contribute to that. Do you now change your original criteria, or do you engage in the thinking to sort of say, actually, the problem that I'm evaluating is a second order problem, so I need to really discern who is going to be voted for, okay? And then the third order thinking would say, what is the average opinion in cases 1 and 2 going to do, and what is the weight between these? Okay, sorry, that should be weight between these. Okay, so how many people are going to pick the prettiest? Okay, how many people are going to wonder what other people are voting for and vote for that? And then I start weighting the problem. So now I have a third order solution. Okay, and then you can build that up to fourth, fifth, and higher orders of thinking. And interestingly enough, this was done by George Maynard Keynes, which the general theory of employment, interest, and money, which is the basis of interest in economics. And his question and his obsession was to sit and say, how can we really understand the higher orders of thinking in order to really understand how the world is put together? Okay. So thinking through the consequences of decisions gives you a major advantage over others who do not. Okay. And it also kind of distances you from the problem for a minute to sit and say, let me not get stuck in what I'm seeing in front of me, and asks, what is bigger than the current situation? What's the impact of this? What is the higher order of what's happening here? If we make this change, what's the implication, and how does that fall through? I think with any kind of thing that requires a person to think, it's often hard and requires a working theory in order to consider the many potential interactions. And if it's a really hard problem, it might be worthwhile to chew on it for a while, write about it, or just ask and say, and if this has happened, what happens from here? So a very practical tool in terms of that. Cool. Okay. The next mental tool is to make reversible decisions, which I thought was a very interesting idea, because we all like our, and I know for myself as well, when I think about making a decision, I feel that it must be something that's significant and that this is the right decision. And you want to kind of balance all the factors 100%. And what happens when you get into a situation where there's indecision? Okay, so how do you strategically remove indecision, and how do you introduce an action bias? Now, I've seen, like, one of the tools that a lot of people use is to say, when things get tough in decision making, they say we need more information. Okay, so they then commission a new study or a new meeting, or they defer or something, and that because they really want to give it due kind of consideration, but how do you get past that? How do you actually get something to that? So we all want to make the most optimal decisions, okay, but then we also want to make decisions quite fast, okay? So, but you don't want to mess it up. You don't want to make a decision and then you've made it too fast, and then you figure, oh, by the way, this is all too bad, or I've made a poor decision. So that finality of decision making creates a block in most people. Okay, so I could ask you, if you want to buy a car foot to it on a final sale, is that more preferable than buying a car with 100% money back guarantee? Okay, so I'm going to go buy a car, and the basic proposition is that I will get all my money back if I don't enjoy the car. Okay, obviously I'm going to go for that deal. Why? Because it's reversible. If I buy a car foot to it off the back of an advert in a newspaper, and it's on final sale, and you must bring cash and it's exchanged on the side of the road, you're not going to feel so comfortable when you switch it on and it starts sputtering. there. So you're going to feel that I've made the wrong decision. Okay. So what's the types of things that we then have to do to make our decisions reversible? So type 1 decisions, and this comes from George Bezos, and it's also described in the book, is type 1 decisions are irreversible, long-term impact, and really important to get right. It is a complex decision-making process, and it does take time. And you want those decisions to take time so that you make the right decision. Okay. But what George Bezos basically says is we often apply a type 1 decision-making framework to a type 2 decision, and even the other way around. We make quick decisions on things that should take time, and we need to be very clear on what type of order of problem something is here. So cool. The type 2 decision is where you are willing to experiment. It's reversible. You may have lost some time and it may have cost some money, but the learning is useful. Okay. And as Frick would also always say, you can lose everything, but don't lose the learning. In fast decision making, if you're using facts, it's usually mostly correct. Okay. So in a reversible decision, I think the types of decisions that are very comfortable with this type of thing is like, let's try a particular price in a particular market. Let's look at a particular product being introduced, a particular type of sampling strategy versus another one, or an activation type methodology, or a temporary change of somebody's role, or trying something, yeah, so that we are moving forward, we promoting the idea of change, and we're creating a positive energy around something, with the understanding that it could be reversible. Okay, and if we like it, we do more of it, and if we don't, we do less of it. Okay, so that's a kind of type 2 decision. A type 1 decision is where you decide, well, I want to change something fundamentally, and there you really want to take the time. So I think the tool here in terms of decision making is to make more reversible decisions and decide what that means, and also to clearly classify some of the decisions that you need to make, to sort of say, this is really worth taking a bit of time, really understanding it and getting it right. Okay. I really love this next one. I think it's maybe the author did it in a particular way, and I think so. He called it seek satisfaction. Okay, not a satisfaction. That's purposefully spelled wrong in the book. And I thought it's like, oh, okay, what is that? Satisfaction? It's like some type of fiction. I said, no, there's this word to satisfice, okay, which is a combination of satisfy and suffice. Okay, apparently introduced by Herbert Simon in the 1950s. Okay, so if you think about that, I am satisfied and it was sufficient. So it's enoughness. Okay, in consulting language, I was taught that we call that the kind of necessary and sufficient conditions for success, and not anything more. Okay, so we typically in decision making follow one of two paths. Okay, one is to maximize our situation, and the other one is to satisfy. Okay, so when I'm maximizing, and that sometimes you can do this, and you've seen other people do it with. I like to think of this as kind of being a fusspot. Yeah, like you take all the time in the world to do a decision, and you still second guess that. Okay, you do hours of research, you kind of visualizing the outcome, and you're second guessing it. And I think of it like when you are going to buy a flat for 25 million rand in Victoria and Alfred waterfront, you're going to check every tile to make sure that you don't have to replace that when you are in that. Not that I can ever do that in my life, but when you go and buy the latest Bugatti Veyron, you will make sure that you've got The stripes are perfect. And even if you see a little scratch on something, you're going to sit there and say, but this is not what I signed up for, yeah, and you're going to be really, really upset. And kind of that's a maximizing, because you want the full experience. You want to make this decision out of a place of abundance and for certainty and etc. So that maximizing feeling of decision making happens to us all in different ways at different times, and it could be even for small things, you know, like I really, really want to buy this particular set of shoes or this particular jersey because it's got these characteristics that will be the best that I could get for the value of money. Okay, and we thought that that's the right thing to do, get the best value for money, but sometimes that could take a long, long time. So we end up evaluating 100 different models of the same thing, and it happens in corporates as well. We test 7 different risk management systems and 7 different CRM systems, and we come to the one that just has the right combination of stuff. Okay. Well, if you took a satisficing view, you would say, well, general purpose is if you're buying a shirt, it should fit, it should fit the rest of your clothes, and you will quickly discard all the unnecessary options, elements or features, although they may be great value. Okay. Just because your shirt comes in a particular packaging or is from a particular brand, etc., wouldn't necessarily matter. Yeah, you can very quickly get into a situation where you can be satisfied if you are that. And obviously, as with all things, sometimes the truth is somewhere in between the two. So if we are discerning about our general purpose purchases, we can often get quite a good value, which is where the satisfaction comes in. The author also quotes the 37% rule of the secretary problem, okay, which is an interesting thing, and especially if you're in recruitment, you would like this to say. They did a study. The details of the study escapes me now. I actually read in another book, and the details wasn't in this book, so I was a little bit annoyed with that. Statistically, after seeing 30% of the candidates for a position of a sample more than 8, you're unlikely to see a better candidate. Okay, so I can go into the stats a little bit on that if you're interested sometime. But basically, if you decided to see 100 different secretaries for a potential position, after the 37th person that you've seen, consistently they found that you will never ever choose anybody beyond that, because there would be no person that is better than that. And if you didn't choose one of the first 37, it's better to choose the last one. Okay. Or the first one for that matter. And how many times have you seen it in your own recruitment where you see the first person, you don't really recruit them? You've seen the second person, you think that they're better or worse than the first person, you see the third person, and you either relate them to the first or the second person. You see the fourth person, and now you're not sure, and you see the fifth person, and you're even more not sure, etc. And then eventually you say either I should go back to the first person or probably the third person. Okay, and that's what happens. And statistically, you are unlikely to find a better candidate. So there's something called Bernoulli's law that looks at the conditionality of options as they evolve, and basically, if you haven't in a choice of either to employ or not employ a person after 7 people that you've seen made a choice, there would be no additional advantage gained. Okay, so and that's an interesting rule of thumb, and also for recruitment. Basically, my advice would be: if you see more than 4 people and you haven't found the person that you're looking for, you must ask if you understand what you're looking for. Or if you are just being fussy, you're maximizing what you could get out of the situation. And a way to also break this satisfaction problem is to set a boundary or a default option. So when you are setting a boundary, for example, you want to buy a shirt and you set a price range or a color or a fabric type, you massively reduce the number of options that need to be considered and can spend a bit more time looking around for options in that category. And that creates the satisfaction. Okay, so by you setting the boundaries of the problem and observing those boundaries, you can't then later sit and say, but I said it should be in this price range, but I'm now looking outside of that price range. Then realize that you are starting to move into maximizing behavior, which sounds nice, but it isn't, because you're not sticking to the program. You're not sticking to your own mental program of ignoring what does not matter. Okay, cool. And you might have emerging priorities. Obviously, that's a different set of issues. Okay, another tool is to stay within the range of 40 to 70%. And this tool is used to balance information with action. And it was originally proposed by Baden Powell, the general. It's not Baden Powell. Sorry, man, his name escapes me now. General Powell, yeah, the person that invaded Iraq. He said, well, for a different decision, you should have no less than 40% and no more than 70% of the information needed to make a decision. Okay, and I thought that was interesting. The 40% side, I kind of understand, okay? But he said, if you spend more of your time to get more than 70% of the information needed to make a decision, you often increase the cost beyond that point of making that decision by too much. So make sure that for a difficult decision that you have no less than 40% and no more than 70% of the information. It avoids kind of analysis paralysis. It creates an action bias, which is very important. And I think if you're in the type of scenario where you've only got 40% of the information, there's two things that happens. One is you can statistically either be right or wrong. Okay, so I know 40% of what's going on here. I could be right or wrong. As long as I start moving in a direction of assuming I was right, I would be moving in the direction of that. Otherwise, I would much quicker find out that I am wrong and be able to course correct. Okay, so and this is played out, for example, in plagues and pandemics, etc. It is better for you to move away from the scenario in which you could potentially get a contagion than to stand still and wait for the contagion to hit you. That's the kind of statistics that come from this rule, where as long as you act, it's often far more important to overcome that initial inertia than it is to have perfect information and then make the right choice. Cool. Okay. This one as well, also attributed to Bezos, founder of Amazon. And this tool is used to consult the future about your decisions. Okay, so imagine that you were 80 years old today and you were looking back at your life, and this particular decision came up in your reflections. What would you say at that point in time about this decision that you're making? And what will people say about you or would have said about you in your life around that decision? Okay. And ask yourself if you would have regret having done what you have done, or if you would have regret not doing this action. Okay. And I find it quite interesting because, you know, like we all want to kind of maybe judge our own greatness at some level. But it's the small decisions that make that difference. And when you now have to evaluate your relationship with people, it's often very difficult to see if in the future you will understand they will understand you, etc. And just casting your mind forward kind of removes some of that short-term turmoil out of the equation, and it gives perspective on the narrative of what we are doing here. Okay, so I think it's definitely worthwhile to sit and say, how will history judge me on this? And that's Aristotle and Plato, which we were talking about yesterday in another forum, also had some of these reflections that they encouraged. Okay, so if we, and I'm mindful of time, move on to the second chapter. We got another set of tools on how to see more clearly. I'll go maybe through these a little bit faster. So how do you ignore black swans? Okay, so in until 1697 in the Western tradition, nobody had known that there were any swans other than white swans. Okay, this guy goes to Australia, he sees a lake full of black swans, and immediately there was a massive uproar in Europe to say, we've totally misunderstood the universe. All swans were thought to be white, and people started betting and speculating about what does this mean, and could there be swans in all colors of the rainbow? Okay, and I think that that's such an interesting kind of example of how we often go. We see one person or one phenomena, like I also call it the sample of one. We find a person or an incident and an anecdote of something that's emerged, and we start imagining everything that led to that. And that's also sometimes called the gambler's fallacy. Because this happened last time, it should happen again, or because this happened last time and these were the conditions, and that was what happened, this is exactly what's going on here. Okay, so, and I think we do that a lot of times, especially as an executive in a large organization. You brought kind of one example of something, and we don't really ask, okay, is this a trend? Is it, how many people are behind this? You know, how big is it? What is the real data? And we just act on kind of a single anecdote that is there. So kind of to ignore the black swans, we kind of need to look very carefully at assessing the likelihood of reoccurrence, managing the impacts and consequences, unless there is really a fundamental change. Okay, and those fundamental change wouldn't then come from one source. So you will see that it affects multiple subsystems on a continuous basis, and that really then signals that there's something that is changing here. So the author's advice in this book is to sort of like ignore the black swans, ignore that kind of single points of advice, but be very mindful when you're seeing a whole bunch of stuff starting to point in the same direction. Then realize that the direction is moving. So sometimes it's worthwhile to wait a little and to get a better insight of what's going on from that point onwards. Look for equilibrium points. This tool is used to find real patterns in data and not to be fooled. So there is a point at which if you throw more people, bodies or money at a problem, the rate of cost outpaces the rate of revenue. That's usually a good inflection point that should give you an indication of balance. Okay, and ask yourself, where does this thing balance? At which point do you lose more than you gain or gain more than you lose? Once you understand that point, you are starting to look for equilibrium points and maximization points. And that's often, I find that this is a very useful kind of mindset when you're setting metrics, that you're looking for equilibrium points, or like how big should a team be, or and often the answer is, if we add one more person and that increases our ability as an organization, it means that we should keep going. And once you start doing the modeling and you realize that there is a point at which that is not true anymore, or the risk is too great in terms of what you're introducing, or you're running out of market space, then that changes the equilibrium point. So find the equilibrium points, because that will give you the indicators of what you should be looking out for and how the scales might tip. other interesting one, which I think was quite interesting in a kind of COVID context, is waiting for the regression to the mean, which is used to find real patterns in data, not to be fooled. Some of the biggest investors in the world depend on this principle. So if you work out what the price of anything should be, so for example, let's say corn, and there's a change in the price of corn, you can predict that it will go back to the mean price of corn over time. Okay, and based on that prediction, whether that's up or down, you will typically make money. Okay, so some of the biggest investors in the world does exactly that. They map out what is out of sync right now. They work out what the mean should be, and they're waiting for the regression to the mean. Okay, so systems tend to stabilize and will eventually revert to a mean. Unless there's a fundamental change, there tends to be the same patterns of supply and demand and similar travel and work patterns, etc. So patterns tend to be in nature everywhere. If the mean is disrupted, so for example in COVID, eventually all elements will strive towards previous means, and that creates an opportunity to understand how things are heading. And we must realize, however, that some systems have changed due to the event and will not reach the mean soon. Being patient, we'll see an eventual regression to a mean, and that mean may be a new mean, but we must realize that at some point in time, the world will have a new normal. Okay, so in knowing that from a COVID perspective, we can predict certain things, but also in normal business, we can, people still have to eat. People still have to find a way to relax, etc. And each one of the things that people do have to do eventually creates a pattern in the behavior. So when we stop seeing fluctuations or fluctuations become predictable, we are likely in a new mean. And that's what you're looking for when you're waiting for the regression to the mean, to sort of say, are we seeing the same patterns as we've been seeing for a while? And when we do, we add a mean point, and then we can mark that point. And then when things start to move in one direction, another direction, we'll come back to a previous mean. Okay, cool. Sounds obvious, very difficult to do, but very profitable if you can. Okay. Now, one of my favorite things, and if you ever want to study a bit of statistics in life, go find the Bayes theorem, where you can use probabilities to predict the future. So if I asked you today, what's the probability of a tornado where you're sitting? It's 1%, possibly, I don't know, even less. And if there was a heavy winds, the probability would probably be 90%. So once you start looking at conditional probability, which is what Bayes statistics does, you can work out the probability of for tornado given heavy winds, which you just work it out. It's very simple. It's taking the 1% and 9%, and the fact that the dependent factor goes under 100 minus 90, that gives you 9%. So you are 9 times more likely to have a tornado given heavy winds. And that insight could make a massive difference in how you look at a situation. So even a little bit of information can help if you understand that there's a causal link and you can work out what that means. And it could also fundamentally alter the probability of something happening at the point of certainty. So we continuously need to calculate conditional probabilities for them to be valid. And even Bayes did that. And when you start thinking in that way, to sit and say, if we know certain things, would that change our perception of what is really happening here? And if we get into that scenario, we can make better decisions. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted to take you through. So there's obviously, there's kind of 3 more chapters of this, very interesting. How do you solve problems? How do you separate correlation from causation? How do you go back to first principles? How do you get peers to review your perspective? How do you, this is really an interesting chapter, and maybe we can talk about that some other time. But I think it's figuring out what you're not good at. How do you kind of get back to basics, follow the path of least, avoid the path of least resistance, and challenge yourself to kind of elevate your thinking. So these are very interesting points. And then things like the Pareto principle, 80-20, there's whole books on that. Occam's razor, the things that's most obvious to the principle is probably the truth, and some of the others. Cool. Okay, so just a kind of quick version of why we're talking about this is we talk about ideas like these in our courses around managing knowledge and innovation, data science for managers, risk management, and also in the Bachelor of Commerce with Edgivas, one of our companies. So if you want to improve your thinking, make sure that you're upgrading your thinking all the time. And thank you so much for participating today with us here in the Executive Book Club. And I would definitely recommend going to look at this book on mental models if you want to have better ways to think about problems and be a little bit more scientific about the outcomes that you've achieved, and also become more effective as a decision maker in the company. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to connecting with you at our next book club. This is the last one for this year, we believe. If one pops up, we'll let you know, and then we're looking to the new year for more programs. Thank you so much for your time.